Good morning, class 10 boys. What we have discussed so far is about the different parts of the brain, the protective covering like the skull, the meninges, and the fluid inside the brain, that is cerebrospinal fluid. Now we will carry on with the next section in this part of the nervous system, that is reflex action. Now, reflex action, as we know, before we talk about reflex action, I think we need to understand that most of the actions of our body is controlled by the brain. Most of the actions are controlled by the brain. It receives various stimuli and from various sources and produces a corresponding response. Whatever stimulus comes, according to that, our body responds. And this is controlled by the brain. But certain stimuli are such which requires very quick responses, which does not involve the thinking process. It does not involve the brain, which is actually involved in the thinking process. So it does not require any thinking. It has to happen all of a sudden, where no brain activity is required. Such processes, which are not directly controlled by the brain, or there is no thinking processes involved, and is a very quick response. For example, removing our hand when we touch a hot plate. If that required thinking, then it will take a longer time, and by that time we think and we process and we remove our hands are already burnt. So this sort of activities in which a very quick response is required, it is the spinal cord which plays the most important role, and this sort of responses, quick responses, is what is known as reflex action. Or we can say reflex actions are spontaneous, involuntary motor responses due to sensory stimuli. We can say reflex action are spontaneous, involuntary motor response to a sensory stimuli. Involuntary means from this itself we can understand it is not under the control of our will. We do not decide. It happens automatically. Like examples we can talk about is coughing, sneezing, blinking of the eye, and various other responses. For these responses we do not think. Now let's move on. Types of reflex reaction. Types of reflex action. Types of reflex action. Number one is inborn. Number one is inborn unconditioned, or we can also say natural. These are reflex actions for which we do not require any training. It is inbuilt, it is already there inside our system. It happens naturally and it does not require any conditioning or learning process. Such type of reflex action is the first type, is known as inborn, unconditional, or we can also say natural reflexes. These are present in our body right from our birth. Like blinking of the eye. When a strong light falls on our eye, we immediately, without even deciding it, we blink our eyes. Or some object comes very close to our eyes, then also we blink our eyes. When we touch a hot place, we remove our hand. We don't have to learn this. Another common thing that we can take here is the knee-jerk experiment. Knee-jerk. That means in a sitting posture, when somebody hammers or slightly strikes the region just below the patella of the knee, our leg automatically flies front. This is what is known as knee-jerk experiment. This is also inborn. It is already there in our body. Like a child's sucks milk from its mother. He is not taught about this. It is already there in his system. So he immediately after his birth starts sucking milk. These are known as inborn reflexes or unconditional reflex or natural reflex, which is already there in our body, for which there is no learning that is required. The next type of reflex action is unconditioned, or we can say acquired. Acquired means you get it from somebody. You learn. If you remember how many pages you have written, just to learn the alphabet A. This type of reflexes which we learn, like playing guitar, like driving a car, reading a book. For this we require days and days of months of learning. Only after that it comes into our system. This sort of reflexes are known as unconditioned reflex. Sorry, I'm very sorry. This has to be conditioned reflex. I'm very sorry. Correct this. Unconditioned is inborn. Conditioned reflex or acquired reflexes. This requires a long period of learning, training. It requires training. Like when you start playing a guitar, you have to literally look at your hands, your fingers, you place your fingers. Only after that, then you get into strumming. But if you keep on learning this, practicing this for some time, it automatically comes to you. This sort of reflexes, which instills in our body and through learning, is what is known as conditioned reflex or acquired reflexes. Let me remind you, it is not unconditioned, this is conditioned reflex. The first one is unconditioned reflex. Now, this conditioned reflex was proved by a psychologist named Pavlov. Pavlov conducted an experiment in which he required 4 important entities: a dog, a kennel, a bell, and food. I'm sure you know what is a kennel. Kennel is a small dog house where a dog lives. Then in that kennel there was a bell that was fitted, and a dog was kept in that, and food was provided. Now Pavlov rang the bell. There was no reaction in the dog. Pavlov gave food to the dog. The dog, on seeing the food, started salivating. So, when only food is given to the dog salivates. But when the bell is rung, the dog does not salivate. Now, what did Pavlov do is, the moment he served food together at the same time, he rang the bell as well. This he conducted for number of days. Food was given, bell was rung, food was given, bell was rung. After a few days, after a long period of training, then what Pavlov did is, he served an empty plate and he rang the bell. He only rang the bell. In the first case, when the food was given, the dog salivated, but when the bell only was rung, the dog did not salivate. But after a long period of learning, training this to the dog, Pavlov then removed the food and he only rang the bell. When he only rang the bell, then also the dog salivated. So, this is what is known as a conditioned or acquired reflex. Like in Nepali, the saying goes, "Agultele haneko kukur, bichudi chamkinda torsincha." That means a fire was thrown at the dog, and due to which, whenever there is lightning, the dog gets frightened because he thinks that the fire is coming close to him. Agultule haneko kukur, bijuli chamkinda torsincha. This is what is known as conditioned reflex. Now, another important thing we need to remember here is the reflex arc. Here we'll talk about components of reflex arc. Reflex arc. The main component of the reflex arc are 5 in number. The path that is followed when there is this reflex action is being transmitted forms a small arc. That is why this is known as the reflex arc. Path followed during the reflex action form an arc through the spinal cord. That is why this is called the reflex arc. And there are 5 components in the reflex arc. The first one is the receptor. Receptor is basically a sense organ which receives the stimulus. The sense organ receives the stimulus, and that stimulus is transmitted by the second component, that is the afferent, or we can also say sensory nerve. The second component is the afferent or the sensory nerve. Now, whatever stimulus is received by the sense organ, the receptor, is conducted, this information or impulse is conducted from the sense organ by the sensory nerve or the afferent nerve to the nerve center. So, this carries nerve impulse to the nerve center. The first one is receptor, second one is afferent or sensory nerve, which function is to carry nerve impulse to the nerve center. Now we move on to the third component, that is nerve center. Now basically what is the nerve center? Nerve center is the grey matter of the brain or the spinal cord. In the case of spinal cord, the grey matter is inside. In the case of brain, the grey matter is outside. So basically, the message from the receptor is carried by the sensory nerve, and finally it carries it to the nerve center. The nerve center is the grey matter of the brain or the spinal cord. It is the grey matter is of the brain or the spinal cord. This information is carried to the nerve center. And in most of the reflex action, so it is basically the afferent sensory nerve carries nerve impulse from the nerve center, and the nerve center is made up of grey matter of the brain or the spinal cord, and in this brain or the spinal cord, the grey matter, here the afferent nerve is directly connected to the efferent nerve or through the internuncial nerve. Internuncial neuron. So, from inside the nerve center in the grey matter, the afferent nerve is directly connected to the efferent nerve, or there could be an intermediate or interneuron, which is also called the internuncial neuron. And here, in the grey matter, the electrical information is converted into motor impulse. Sensory information, that is electrical information, sensory information is converted into the motor impulse. It is converted into motor impulse because here in the grey matter, that whatever information, sensory information as brought by the afferent nerve is analyzed, and the type of reaction it has to show is converted accordingly, and it is changed into motor impulse and passed on to the efferent or the motor nerve. So this is the third component. Now let's carry on with the fourth component. Fourth component is efferent or motor nerve. Efferent or the motor nerve. Now whatever has been analyzed in this third component, that is the grey matter. As we know, grey matter means there is large concentration of cell bodies. So that information which was brought by the afferent neuron is now analyzed, and whatever information, the sensory information is converted into motor information. That motor information is carried by the efferent nerve. It is basically the carrier of the motor information from the nerve center to the effector organ. Effector organ. And that organ could be a muscle or a gland or different parts of the body. Now, this is the fourth component. Let's carry on with the fifth component. Fifth component is the effector organ. And this effector organ can be a muscle, like in the case of hand. In the case of hand touching a hot plate, the effector organ has to be muscle because the muscles of the hand has to contract to remove our hand. So here it is the muscles, or it could be a gland. So these are the 5 components of the reflex arc. Now let us draw the reflex arc and understand how it works. Okay, let us draw the reflex. As we know, the most important component of the reflex arc is the spinal cord. Spinal cord. The spinal cord with the central canal. Then we have the grey matter present like this. Grey matter at the center. Grey matter. Grey matter inside. The receptor. I'm just trying to show you the arrangement of the 5 components. The receptor means sense organs. This sense organ receives the stimulus and it is passed on. Here we have a small dorsal horn here, and this enters into the grey matter of the spinal cord. Grey matter of the spinal cord. Then we have a small interneuron or the internasal neuron. Then the beginning of the motor nerve. Motor nerve goes to the effector. This effector could be a muscle or a gland. The receptor is the first component. The second component is the sensory, or we have already talked about. Sensory or the sensory nerve or the afferent nerve, then that carries the message into the grey matter. And then the beginning of the motor nerve, motor nerve goes to the effector. This effector could be a muscle or a gland. The receptor is the first component. The second component is the sensory, or we have already talked about. Sensory or the sensory nerve or the afferent nerve, then that carries the message into the grey matter. In the grey matter, there could be another neuron that is called the internuncial neuron. So 1, 2, 3. Now this nerve carries information that is analyzed by the grey matter and carries it to the effector. This is called the motor or efferent nerve, and finally the effector. So you see here there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components of the reflex arc. So this is the 5 components. These are the 5 components of the reflex arc. Now it is very important to understand here that this reflex activity is very important. It is so very important that it can save one's life as well. Like somebody punches at you, the reflex is to dodge. If that punch actually lands on some delicate part of your body, one could be dead. So this reflex arc saves you from such activities. When something enters into your respiratory tract, especially when we are eating and talking, when something enters into our respiratory tract, we might get choked and we might get killed. But it is the reflex action which saves us from being killed. Because moment something enters into our respiratory tract, what happens is we start coughing. And when we cough, we force air out of the lungs through the windpipe, which actually throws out the particles that are into the respiratory tract. When we eat something very obnoxious and it enters into our stomach, there is a abdominal reflex which helps us to vomit it out. When something very irritating strikes your nose, we start sneezing, removing that substance as well. So reflex action is very important, and it is important sometimes for our survival as well. So this is it as far as reflex action is concerned. In the next class we'll talk about the structure of the eye and how it works. After that we talk about locomotion.